Hey, hey, hey! It's your friendly neighborhood religious studies podcast, the RSP. I'm David Robertson.
And I'm Christopher Cotter, and you'll probably tell that we've both seen the new Avengers film quite recently, and in fact, we took a very long time to actually start recording because we were dissecting it.
Yeah, and if you've seen it, there's parts of the film where they're very close to where we're recording today. In fact, I'm about 2 minutes away. That big fight sequence at the beginning where they can deep fry your kebab.
Exactly.
And on the roof of St. Giles. Anyway, enough of this.
Talking about dissecting.
Very good. Very good. Today we are going to be moving from static categories to a river of theories in this interview by Daniel Gorman Jr. with Josephson-Storm, his return visit to the RSP, I think. Mm-hmm. And in this time, he's talking about his book, The Myth of Disenchantment. So let's have it.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Good afternoon, Dan.
So Jason Josephson-Storm is calling in today from Williamstown, Massachusetts.
Indeed. The snowy part of the western part of the state, yeah.
And I'm sitting in my kitchen. The snow hasn't reached me yet. All right. Today we will be talking about your new book, The Myth of Disenchantment, Magic, Modernity, and the Birth of the Human Sciences, published last May by University of Chicago Press. But I think before we get into that, we should tell our listeners where you're from, historiographically. Your first book was set across the Pacific, The Invention of Religion in Japan.
Yeah, indeed. My first book was my dissertation, and a heavily revised dissertation, but called The Invention of Religion in Japan. And it was basically about Japanese intellectuals encountering the category religion for the first time in a set of trade treaties in the mid-19th century, and trying to figure out what the word religion meant. Because there was no necessarily equivalent translation term for religion in Japanese, and they had no clear idea what, if anything, in Japan was a religion or counted as a member of the category religion. And then in that book, I traced how the category religion was debated and articulated in Japan, and how Japanese thinkers came to see that the term was embedded in a set of contrasts. On the one hand, with religion and science as putative opposites, and in the other as sort of religion and superstition as another kind of imposing term. And to figure out one, you had to figure out the other. At least that's what Japanese thinkers ended up deciding. And they ended up coining a completely new vocabulary of new terms in Japanese. For example, like the term shukyo for religion, or kagaku for science, that didn't exist before this encounter with European thought. So that was, the dissertation I did both sides of the encounter, but mostly I was looking at Japanese sources, Japanese thinkers looking to the West, and then in some cases in that book, I flipped the encounter and looked at Europeans writing about Japan in the same period and looked at their sort of mismatch of conceptual ideas and terms. Yeah.
If I remember correctly, in The Invention of Religion in Japan, you talk about a few Japanese intellectuals who spend time studying in the United States.
Yeah, that's right, including thinkers like Moriari Nori, who famously came to the United States. I think he was at Amherst College, actually, which is our arch rival here from Williams. But I look at a number of Japanese intellectuals who traveled in the United States and wrote about their experiences there, definitely, and sort of tried to figure out the central edifices of Western thought. And this is a group of Japanese intellectuals whose writings on the West has been historically less studied because they said weird things that don't fit the story that European thinkers have liked to tell about Europe. And so they were sort of considered to have gotten it wrong. But actually, I think that they had a lot of perceptive, interesting things to say. So that was the first book, yeah.
I want to dig into that a little bit. You're mentioning the story that Western Europeans are telling about themselves. And that's a central idea to The Myth of Disenchantment, your next book. What do you see as the story they're telling about themselves?
So one of the things that the Europeans presented was an equation between their technological civilization, in other words, their guns and boats and what have you, and their either cultural or intellectual traditions, and Europeans tended to tie them together and argue for the superiority and the fundamental connection from the two. So even though gunpowder was invented in China, the printing press had its earlier formation, for example, in China, although we can't see direct transmission there, Europeans presented European technology as proof that European civilization was superior, and they claimed often that European civilization was superior for two competing reasons, either because European civilization at that time was considered Christian, or they claimed that their civilization was superior because it was more rational. But Japanese intellectuals encountering European culture were worried about what is this Christianity? Is it uniform? Or more particularly, they also questioned the simple equation of rationality in European thought. And versions of that were questions about this disenchantment narrative. So the Europeans often claimed that their particular superiority came from the fact that they had disabused themselves of superstitions. But as some Japanese thinkers noticed, and this didn't make it into the first book or in the second book, but I'm publishing it elsewhere as an article, a bunch of Japanese thinkers, instead of seeing a disenchanted West, saw a West full of spiritualists, full of people believing in the occult, full of Pentecostal religious revivals, full of people who believed in charms and the efficacy of talismans. So in that respect, the presentation of a West as particularly a Europe or an America as radically other in terms of its lack of superstitions didn't make sense to them. They could see not only a disenchanted West, but in a way a mystical West. And this also paralleled, as they saw it, European interest in things like X-rays and radioactivity. European science was populating the world with invisible forces, and a number of European thinkers equated those, talked about spiritualism in terms of radioactivity or in terms of X-rays and what have you. So one of the things that that interested me was this interesting reading of Japanese thinkers produced about the West. The other things that they saw or didn't see that I found interesting in that project were distinctions between philosophy and religion they found to be really problematic, or the idea of a secular state was a complex construct that seemed in many respects mythical or what have you. Anyway, that's a lot about that book. Yeah.
What you're suggesting is that with these Japanese intellectuals in the late 19th century, they're looking and saying, I mean, with their connection between science and religion, they're anticipating figures like Alfred North Whitehead, rather.
Uh-huh. You mean who might see those two as having a different relationship? You're saying
so, for instance, Whitehead is a mathematician, but he's talking about universal principles of the spirit. He's making those connections. William James is using social science, but he's also interested in psychical phenomena. These individuals don't fit neatly into the philosophical box you're describing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they didn't fit in that box from Japanese scholars, and they don't fit that opposition. A lot of European history doesn't fit that opposition today. Like one of the grand myths that I'm, to sort of pivot to the next book that I'm even interrogating in The Myth of Disenchantment, is this notion of a necessary conflict between religion and science, which turns out to be a pervasive myth articulated basically in the 19th century in Europe and America. And it presumes that religion and science are necessarily in conflict. And there are a lot of interesting things we could say about, for example, Draper, who's the first to talk about the conflict model, which he himself already uses as a Protestant anti-Catholic argument. Or we could say something about the number of scientists themselves who have not seen these two things in conflict or whatever. But what I was really interested in is how the categories of religion and science got articulated as spaces, as terrains, to borrow something that Peter Harrison later talked about. He uses that language. But to think about how religion and science were defined in opposition. And one of the things that I noticed, and I'm sorry if I get excited, I talk too fast, I'll try and slow down a little bit. But like one of the things I noticed is that conceptually there was often a third term. Like not only were religion and science positioned in conflict as part of this myth of a conflict model, but also often religion was seen as opposed to something called superstition, which was like the pseudo-religion or the thing that looks like religion but is not religion, is often described as either superstition or magic. And in the similarly, science was often positioned in opposition to something called pseudoscience, which was often also described as superstition or magic. So it seemed like the intellectual edifice that was being formulated in the 19th century was a triadic oppositional structure between, on the one hand, a conversation about the difference between religion and science, but also religion and magic, and in particular also, or magic and science, and in particular areas that religion and science seemed to overlap were the most likely to be policed as illegitimate, as pseudoscience or as magic or as, and I'm thinking of things like psychical research or spiritualism, table turning and what have you, that presented itself as a science of the dead. And so that terrain became fraught and policed, yeah.
Something like spiritualism, it satisfies neither the pure modernists, the scientists, and it doesn't satisfy the Christians either.
Yeah, often, yeah. And although, right, exactly. So, although there are a range of scientists who love spiritualism and then a range of Christians or, well, let's say Quakers or what have you, that as we know, were into spiritualism. But you're right that it didn't fit the clean definitionary lines, and that became an object of attack from both sides. And so Yeah. So anyway, so one of the things that sort of already motivated the transition between the two books was I got interested in trying to figure out if in Japan in the 19th century, they were encountering these three categories as if they were already accomplished things: religion, science, and magic or superstition. I was interested in how those three got formulated as three distinct categories in European thought, and how much boundary work was going on in policing them, and then also the ways that that boundary work collapsed. And then the other kind of insight that motivated this second project is that a lot of the conversation about this third term, magic or spiritualism, connected itself up to a notion of modernity as such. So one of the central myths that I think we still share in much of the social sciences is the notion of some grand periodization called modernity. And the idea is that at a certain point, and everybody disagrees about when, maybe with the birth of the printing press or industrialization or the Protestant Reformation or what have you, there's a rupture after which we enter a period called modernity. But often modernity is described in terms of something called disenchantment. And that disenchantment is usually defined as an end of belief in spirits or an end of belief in magic. But the problem is that if you look at it, and I have a chapter that looks at the contemporary sociological evidence, people didn't stop believing in spirits. Many Americans, arguably depending on how you define the categories, something like 75% of Americans hold on to some kind of paranormal or enchanted belief. Belief in spirits, in ghosts, in angels, in demons that possess people, etc., psychical powers. All this stuff is really widespread. Astrology, for example. So, we might guess that the academy has more skeptics than others, but even then it's not necessarily clear. It's just there are different kinds of beliefs that people have. So, and what's more, so it doesn't look like contemporary America is disenchanted according to those logics, or contemporary Western Europe. And what's more, it turns out that the notion of modernity as itself disenchanted was basically formulated in the 19th century. And this is a period where scholars have already had a lot to say about occult revivals, about the importance of spiritualist seances, about widespread birth of psychical research and theosophy and a whole bunch of other traditions. And so it turns out that as I argue in this book, in The Myth of Disenchantment, after looking at I started looking at these founding figures of this narrative of modernity as disenchantment, who are often the founders of many of our disciplines, founders of sociology or psychology or psychoanalysis or philosophy or religious studies. And I looked through their diaries and their letters, and I was able to locate them in the exact milieu where magic was itself being practiced or believed. Like they hung out with spiritualists, or they themselves called their own project theosophy and talked to these theosophists. So it looks like, in a way, that the myth of magic's departure was part and parcel of the conversations of occultists as well as scholars of religion. So Helena Blavatsky, for example, the founder of the Theosophical Society, she described modernity in terms of disenchantment and said that the central feature of the West was that it had lost belief in magic, even as she wanted to turn to India and her hidden masters to recoup the missing pieces. So what looked like the difference, normally disciplines like sociology and religious studies are described themselves as disenchanting or secularizing, but that becomes harder to countenance when you know that in the individual lives of a lot of these people, let's say Sigmund Freud, they find themselves having the beliefs that they are themselves describing as archaic. So what it means is that there's a way in which this very notion of modernity as disenchanted turns out to be a myth, and that turns out to be one of the main things I try to argue in the book. Basically, not only isn't it true now, it wasn't true then, and we can see if we look at the lives, the private lives of a lot of these thinkers, that they had all these kind of, let's say, heterodox or complicated or interesting or enchanted beliefs themselves. So I think that's one of the big payoffs.
So you mentioned if it's a flawed narrative to say that there's a triadic opposition of magic, Western Christianity, and spiritualism. If that's a flawed model and everything's more fluid, and as you say, you have scientists like Curie and Max Muller who are going to seances, then what is the correct structure? Is there even a structure? Should we get rid of this triad? Is it the tesseract and multiple dimensions wrapping around itself? What is it?
So I think we tend to think of this triad as necessary and universal, but I think we're wrong about that. So what I'm not saying is that nobody believed in this triad, but rather in the process of constructing this triad, we carved out a much more complex, either heterogeneous space, and then made a bunch of arbitrary divisions around it. So one of the things I'm trying to do is challenge the presumption of that triad. I would agree that it needs to be unwoven in a certain way, but that doesn't mean that we deny that we've had this history. So, one of the things that I'm really interested in is how we study, to take a step back, these higher categories. So we spend a bunch of time studying within in the horizon of these categories. So let's say, we spend a bunch of time thinking that religion was a universal and then trying to define the features that religion has. What's your definition of religion and how is it in all societies and all cultures? I don't think that project has failed. And it's not just failed. My book isn't the first to show this, or neither of my books are the first to show this, but there's a lot of evidence that the category of religion is takes its primary formulation in a particular period in Euro-American history and then is imposed in a heavily negotiated and contested way in the rest of the globe. But what we can do as scholars is then not study the category as a universal thing, but study the category as it is articulated and the effects that it's had. So we can trace this category as a kind of unfolding process, or what I like to call a higher order assemblage, and look at how various things are recruited into it. It's like an unfolding process, like a stream. To take a Whiteheadian metaphor, what I'm trying to do is a kind of, instead of a process physics, a kind of process anthropology, and look at how these categories were historically conditioned and articulated and the implications of doing that. And that means that we have to locate ourselves as scholars within the categories themselves and our attempt to kind of work them out. Anyway, this is stuff I'm working on for the next book, so I probably shouldn't get monologue more about it. But I'm working on a book called Absolute Disruption, The Future of Theory After Postmodernism, and that's exactly about how do we work with and study these higher order categories, and how do we sort of function without returning to the older discredited modernism or turning into the wordplay of postmodernism. And what I argue for is a kind of pride in humble science is one of my phrases. And I can come up with a story, and I come up with a kind of new philosophy of social science for a post-Kuhnian way of looking at the world as kind of these aggregated sort of processes. But I should probably step back and
there's a little bit to unpack there.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
Let's begin with this idea of, I think one of the things we're dancing around this conversation is there's a difference between studying something and there's a difference between practicing it. So you mentioned, for instance, there are people in the 19th century who believe in the triumvirate of magic, spiritualism, and science. No, excuse me. I got the triumvirate wrong. The triumvirate is Christianity, spiritualism, and science. Okay, take a step back to the present.
Religion, science, and magic, or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So then, us as a scholar looking back, you're seeing the flowing river where it's all intertwined, and there is no simple static thing. So then let's go another level, okay? So you've got the people in the past with the triad. You've got the people today, you, studying it, saying, no, I see a stream in which these people were functioning. So what's the next step? Where do we go if we're saying that our narrative of modernity and postmodernity is flawed? What's the next step for building a framework to understand this stuff?
So what I'm saying is that we locate ourselves within the horizon of temporality. So, I mean, in that respect, one of the things that we have to do is recognize the limitedness of our own conceptual categories. I mean, now we're really onto my third book stuff, so I mean, this is fun. But one of the things that we do is we have to recognize that there's a way in which I should take a step back and talk about the history of modernism and postmodernism, and then tell you. One of the things that many of the academic disciplines were predicated on was a notion of concepts that was essentially Aristotelian in its basic function. This is a notion of concepts as having necessary and sufficient conditions for membership, and what's more, we thought that our concepts mapped onto the world, that they cut up what the Greeks had called the joints of nature, in other words, looked at where nature divided things up, so made natural kinds of distinctions. This is often called natural kinds. So we thought that if you could find necessary and sufficient conditions for membership in a given category, and you could identify its essence, and if you could say something about its essence, you could begin to discover and develop, let's say, robust or scientific knowledge about a subject. in the hard sciences, we've already begun to challenge the notion of essences, and I think a lot of philosophy of science has already moved past the way that those conceptual categories are articulated. But in the humanities, we also had a crisis around this because we discovered that many of our concepts no longer worked. The capacity to produce necessary and sufficient conditions for the category of religion turns out to have been a flawed process, etc. So the question then becomes we have to then, instead of thinking of nature as jointed in the old-fashioned way, we have to think of it in a way, a kind of a disjointed nature. And this is at least true, even if you think that there's a distinction between natural kinds and human kinds in which nature itself has joints. It's pretty clear that that human kinds don't have the kinds of joints that we would like to project upon them. The joints that we have are historically contingent. So, and part of what we end up doing is then studying, locating ourselves within our study. So this is a kind of reflexivity, and then focusing on how these conceptual categories are themselves constructed. But I worry that we're getting away from the...
Yeah, I feel like we're moving beyond the myth of disenchantment to what comes after after we realize the myth of disenchantment is flawed. And we're also running out of time. So we sketched out the theoretical terrain. But I think what struck me with this book is that as much as we talk about the critical theory and, the flawed basis of modernity, you're showing an incredible range of material in at least, let's see, German, French. And you're doing comparative linguistic work here also.
Yeah.
What is your I mean, it almost sounds like a Larry King softball question, but I am curious, what is your language training to be able to do a book like this? Because it's almost like you were doing the work of 4 books in one. You're talking about German intellectual history, you talk about the Renaissance, you talk about occultism in Britain and America in the 50s.
Yeah, so I grew up bilingual with French and English, and I went to a French and English educational school until I went to high school. And then having basically tested out of high school French, I started Japanese in high school. And my mother was born in Germany, so I grew up also with hearing a lot of German. And so I had basically, German is my weakest of those languages. I also spent some time in Barcelona studying Spanish. And then when I was lived in France for a couple of years, lived in Japan, lived in Germany. So, and when I was in Japan, I studied classical Chinese. So basically, I have English, French, Spanish, German, Japanese, and classical Chinese. And then from Romance languages, Germanic languages, you can get to other Romance and Germanic languages easily. And then when I was here a few years ago at Williams, I did tutoring received tutoring from Chris Lavelle, who's a classicist here in Latin. So I was working on building my Latin. At the moment, I've just started, I love languages. I've just started Biblical Hebrew. So in fact, what I'm going to go to in 30 minutes is my Hebrew lesson. But I just love languages. I just love them. I'm a reader of languages more than a speaker of languages. I think even though I talk quickly, when I like to be grammatical, and then I get tongue-tied if I'm trying to speak. I speak all my languages better drunk, for example. But I love like really puzzling things out philologically. So that's the kind of stuff that was in the background of this book. Yeah. So yeah.
You also mentioned in our conversation the idea of there are moments in history, as you see it, sort of these explosive junctures that unsettle our models for understanding the world. Even look at Japan. The arrival of the Westerners unsettles their way of not seeing a division between spirituality and nature. For Westerners, the atomic bomb, the discovery of the germ, the DNA, these sort of explosive moments. And I find it interesting that you started writing The Myth of Disenchantment after an explosive moment, the Fukushima disaster. Yeah. So we're talking about reflexivity. So I'm trying to situate you, Josephson-Storm, in the fields that you're talking about. Where are you in the stream?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big question. Do you want to know why I came to this particular project when, or do you want to hear about how I shifted from Japan to the Western European thing, or do you want? I could go so many different directions. That's a good one. Yeah.
Well, let's focus on, since we're talking about historical moments that upset the stream, that upset the models. Yeah. For you, I want to talk about the Fukushima thing, and how does that affect the way you conceive of religion?
Yeah. For me, I was, as I mentioned at the beginning of this book, after I'd finished The Invention of Religion in Japan, but before it had come to press, I was starting research on another project that was going to be about, it was called Ghosts and Resurrections in contemporary Japan, and it was about sort of the history of the notion of spirits and about contemporary belief in talismans. And I was going to make the argument, or I was already making the argument that 19th and 20th century Japan wasn't disenchanted. But then the incident, I'd already done a lot of research toward that project. And one of the things that tipped me the other way, just by chance of timing, I was in Kyoto. I was on on a sabbatical doing an early pre-tenure sabbatical doing research. And I was actually at a tattoo parlor getting some tattoo work done when the Fukushima incident happened. It was actually the earthquake off of the coast of Tohoku. We didn't know it was Fukushima yet. And the earthquakes are not uncommon in Japan. They're pretty common. And we didn't right away know that it was how huge the effects were going to be. So a lot of people in the tattoo parlor would just stop what we were doing, and we were just watching the television screens. And I remember seeing the images of the tsunami, but not yet being aware of that how tragic and disastrous it was going to be in terms of loss of human life. And one of the guys at the tattoo parlor was asking me about my research, and I started talking about asking people about their belief in talismans and ghosts and spirit visions, and talking about that kind of thing. And there was one other non-Japanese person there, and and when we were having this conversation, this guy who I think probably was from either Norway or Sweden or something like that was like, "Oh, of course Japanese people believe in all these magical things but that's because Japan is a kind of like mystical Asia where people still believe in magic, but the West people don't believe in anything like that." And I thought that binary was junk. It was bull. And in particular, in part, to say autobiographically, it's because my grandmother was a famous anthropologist, Felicitas Gutmann, who herself went kind of, the term that people used to describe her was went native. She, on the Paca Reservation in New Mexico, she started believing in the existence of spirits. And I remember from growing up, that her offering cornmeal to the ghosts as when the sunrise came out to the spirits of the ancestors and what have you, and the spirits of the land. And I knew that a lot of people came from all over the world to attend these sessions that she gave on the reservation. So sometimes famous sociologists, anthropologists, and artists from Germany, from Mexico, from the United States. And so I was always, felt a bit of an outsider to that community, but I greatly admired my grandmother, who was one of my intellectual heroes, one of the reasons I study religion. And so I knew at least that she was strange, but she wasn't that strange. And so this reinforced my sense that this binary between an enchanted Asia and a disenchanted West was in itself a kind of mythical distinction. So that's one of the things that gave birth to this project, to kind of look at Europe with the eyes of an outsider anthropologist, or look at Europe and America from this semi-outsider vantage point. And that's where, I think I saw a lot of things that I didn't expect to see, perhaps. And then the other, but concretely in terms of disaster, I was planning to go to Tokyo, and it looked like Tokyo was. They were like, you couldn't get food. They were having trouble shipping stuff into the city. I was looking at online at radiation levels that were spiking. And I just thought it was probably, I wasn't going to be able to get the kind of research that I was going to get done in Tokyo. So I went to Germany, where I was intending to go at some point after that anyway. So the disaster in a way uprooted me. And, I made sure that my Japanese friends were safe, and I tried to keep tabs on things, but I knew that, it wasn't going to be conducive to, an American rooting around in the archives wasn't going to be conducive to what was happening in Fukushima and Tohoku in that particular moment. So I went to Germany, and then went through the German archives basically. I was trying to beef up my German, so I started reading a lot of stuff in German then. Yeah,
we've gone around the world, I think, 3 times at this point.
Yeah.
But so I think, to wrap up, I think the fact is, with the stuff we're talking about, we could go on about this for hours, but our listeners only have about half an hour. So to wrap up, totally. I think what I see as the contribution of your book is that it's identifying, instead of the singular us v them, science or Christian scientists, that's 2 separate words, Christian scientists, not Christian scientists, the religion, versus the spiritualists. By showing the fact that it's more complicated, I saw a couple different strands in your book, and I want you to critique me if you think I've got the wrong strands. You've got Christians who are scientists and spiritualists. You have scientists who are spiritualists. You have spiritualists who aren't scientists but reject Christianity. So my point is, like, every single one of the part of the triad, you could flip that a couple different ways, and so suddenly you've got 6 or 7, I don't know, how many strands would you see in the book of how many different boxes people can fall into?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't organize it that way, but I mean, I did organize it around the birth of these different disciplines. So I think you're right. In looking at the birth of these different disciplines, what I was interested in is the different ways that people navigated those categories. And you're right, they're like a plurality, almost any option. You could be pro-science, pro-magic, anti-science, anti-magic, pro-Christianity, pro-magic, anti-Christianity, pro-magic. I mean, all the possible options in much more pluralistic way than you would get if you bought the story that suggested that the central feature of modernity is that people no longer believed in spirits or magics.
So what you're talking about is also a more interesting story.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope I highlight some interesting complexities and interesting figures. And I found a lot of stuff. I was surprised, the amount of stuff that I found that either was in diaries or letters or things that were lesser known works of a range of figures that really, doesn't fit our received impression of these people. So both, and I look at not just the founders of a lot of academic disciplines, but just for the sake of your readers, I look at also a number of famous magicians and occultists and show how they were in dialogue with the academic world more than people often suppose. So, Aleister Crowley and Helena Blavatsky, for example, as two key examples. And then I do 500 years of history. So, basically it's Francis Bacon to the Vienna positivists. So, well, maybe not quite 500 years, but more like, but 400 years of history. Yeah, it's a lot. It was a lot of stuff. It was a lot of fun. I had to leave out a lot.
I think, and I've seen some of those articles. You published, for instance, the one called, what's it, God's Shadow? The one about the founders of the study of religion who were also obsessed with ghosts.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, indeed.
So I think... Sorry, I didn't mean
to
cut you off. What were you saying?
No. Yeah. So so the book is, there are a lot of pieces that I had to cut out of it, and a bunch of it, some of it has appeared in articles, and I have a bunch more book chapters coming out that'll look at different pieces. But I'm trying to move off of that. But I just had so much, and then I had to cut it down for publishing purposes. So it's a little bit tight in terms of the prose, but there's a lot of evidence there. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you, Dr. Josephson-Storm. It's been a very lively conversation.
And we speak to you too.
And having gone from the triad, which is flawed, to the stream, which is interesting, I'm interested to see what your theoretical book will say next. Because once you explode the streams, and living in an age of fake news where anything goes, I'm very interested in where the study of religion and how we understand it goes next.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I'm working on. Yeah.
Yeah. If you come up with a good answer, let me know.
You'll have to read the book or interview me when the next one comes out. It's under contract. I'm claiming I'm going to have it to the press by the end of 2019. So I have to come up with an answer by then anyway. We'll hope it's a good one. Yeah.
Go test it on your undergrads.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you very much.
Good to speak to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Dan and Jason. Great to hear both of you back on the podcast again. Jason also, he had I think in the latest issue of Method and Theory, there was a sort of semi-symposium type thing kicked off by Jason, which was quite interesting. So I would recommend you checking that out as well. Another thing that you should check out is the call for papers for the BASR conference with the Irish Society in Belfast in September. We've extended the deadline to the end of May. And that is genuinely because of high levels of interest. There's a lot of folk coming out of the woodwork with panel proposals that haven't been to the BASR for a wee while, so it's quite exciting.
Yeah, it's going to be great. And I know the hosts. It's going to be a lot of fun. Plus, we've got our Christmas special recording as well, as is now traditional, and we've started work on the planning for that. So stay tuned.
Stay tuned indeed. Stay tuned to the RSP as well, where next week my good friend here, David Robertson, will be speaking with Anne Taves, who is another returnee to the podcast. She's been on a couple of times now in different forms, and talking about the topic of her gunning lectures at the University of Edinburgh a month or so ago on worldviews and ways of life.
Yeah, I really enjoyed speaking to Anne and spending time with her when she was in Edinburgh recently. I don't know that we've got too much else to say, really. I mean, we're coming towards the end of the season.
Yeah.
Season? Series? What do we call it? Semester?
Well, any of those. Choose your poison. But there's one thing that we always have to say.
Thanks
for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The RSP is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SCO 47750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and our managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.